On March 17, 1984, in a remote cabin 40 miles outside Denver, Colorado, a 51-year-old woman named Dorothy Mitchell sat across from her 19-year-old daughter, Sarah, and did something she never thought she'd have to do. She looked her daughter in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not letting you leave this room until you remember who you are." Sarah had been missing for 14 months, not missing in the sense that police were searching for her body. Missing in the sense that the young woman sitting in that cabin, dressed in clothes she'd been wearing for 3 days, speaking in monotone about spiritual warfare and demonic possession, wasn't Sarah anymore. She was Sister Deborah, a devoted member of a fundamentalist Christian cult called the Shepherd's Assembly, and she'd been sent home by the cult leadership specifically to recruit her family. Dorothy Mitchell had spent 14 months trying every legal option to reach her daughter, had driven to the cult compound in rural Wyoming 6 times, been turned away each time, had hired lawyers who told her there was nothing they could do, had contacted police who explained that 19-year-olds have the right to join whatever religious group they choose, had prayed, had cried, had nearly given up, until she heard about Priscilla Coates, a woman who'd lost her own son to a cult, who'd gotten him out, who'd dedicated her life to helping other parents do the same, and who, unlike the male deprogrammers who dominated the field, understood something about the specific ways cults manipulated young women that the men often missed. What happened over the next 6 days in that Colorado cabin would test everything Dorothy believed about motherhood, about faith, about the line between saving someone and breaking them. And it would force both Dorothy and Sarah to confront a question that had no easy answer. Can you fight brainwashing with more psychological pressure? Or does that just replace one form of control with another? The Shepherd's Assembly would later call it kidnapping and spiritual assault. The FBI would investigate but ultimately declined to press charges. Dorothy Mitchell would call it the hardest thing she'd ever done and the only choice she had left. And Sarah Mitchell, depending on which year you asked her, would call Priscilla Coates either the woman who saved her life or the woman who violated her in ways she'd never fully recover from. But the reason Dorothy hired a female deprogrammer instead of Ted Patrick or one of the other men who'd built reputations in the field wasn't just because Priscilla had a good success rate. It was because Dorothy understood something the male deprogrammers sometimes didn't. That young women in authoritarian religious groups experienced a specific kind of psychological manipulation around purity, submission, and spiritual authority that required someone who understood those dynamics from the inside. Priscilla Coates had been there, had lost her son to the Unification Church, had fought to get him back, had learned deprogramming techniques from Ted Patrick himself, and then developed her own methods, specifically designed for the religious cults that targeted young women with promises of purpose and belonging while demanding total surrender of their autonomy. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme religious manipulation, mother-daughter conflict, forced deprogramming, psychological coercion, and the question of whether a mother has the right to kidnap her own adult daughter to save her from a cult. Denver, Colorado in March 1984 was a city still recovering from recession and looking toward an uncertain future. Population just over 500,000, the city sprawled across the high plains east of the Rocky Mountains at an elevation of exactly 1 mile above sea level. The air was thin enough that newcomers got winded climbing stairs. The weather was unpredictable enough that locals joked you could experience all 4 seasons in a single day. March in Denver meant temperatures that could swing from 2 degrees Celsius at dawn to 18 degrees by afternoon. Snow was still possible, but so was sunshine warm enough to melt whatever snow had fallen overnight. The mountains to the west were still heavy with snowpack that would feed the rivers through summer. The plains to the east stretched flat and brown, waiting for spring. Denver in 1984 was a city caught between its mining town past and its uncertain future. The oil boom that had brought prosperity in the late 70s was collapsing. Unemployment was climbing toward 8%. But the city was also diversifying, attracting tech companies and telecommunications firms, and people fleeing the expensive coasts for Colorado's combination of outdoor recreation and lower cost of living. The religious landscape was shifting too. Traditional mainline Protestant churches were losing members to evangelical movements that promised more direct religious experience, more community, more certainty in an uncertain world. Megachurches were starting to emerge. Televangelists were reaching millions through cable television. And alongside the legitimate religious revival, predatory groups were recruiting aggressively from young people searching for meaning. The Shepherd's Assembly had been founded in 1979 by a former insurance salesman named James Whitfield, who claimed to have received a divine vision instructing him to gather the faithful remnant before the end times. According to Whitfield's theology, mainstream Christianity had become corrupted by worldly compromise. The true believers needed to separate themselves completely from secular society, live in intentional communities under strict spiritual authority, and prepare for the tribulation that would precede Christ's return. The theology was a mix of fundamentalist Christianity, charismatic spiritual warfare doctrines, and authoritarian control structures borrowed from various cult models. Members were expected to surrender their possessions to the community, live in gender-segregated dormitories on the compound, work without pay in the cult's businesses, submit absolutely to leadership authority, cut contact with family members who weren't believers, and dedicate themselves to recruiting new members who would expand the community before the end came. By 1984, the Shepherd's Assembly had approximately 230 members living on a compound outside Laramie, Wyoming. Most were between 18 and 35 years old. Most had joined within the previous 3 years, and most had been recruited through campus ministries at colleges across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. The recruitment technique was sophisticated. Shepherd's Assembly members would join existing campus Christian groups, establish themselves as committed believers, build friendships with students who seemed spiritually hungry or socially isolated. Then gradually introduce Shepherd's Assembly theology as a deeper, more authentic version of Christianity. Invite people to weekend retreats at the Wyoming compound. Love bomb them with community and acceptance and purpose. By the time recruits realized the group was more cult than church, they were already psychologically invested, had been told that doubts were satanic attacks, that family members who questioned were being used by demons. That leaving would result in spiritual death and eternal damnation. The psychological manipulation was wrapped in enough legitimate Christian language that it was hard for young believers to distinguish between authentic faith and cult control. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was 19 years old in January 1983 when she first encountered the Shepherd's Assembly at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, where she was a sophomore studying elementary education. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, 128 pounds. With long blonde hair she usually wore in a braid, and blue eyes that her mother always said were too trusting, too quick to see the best in people, even when those people didn't deserve it. On her left ankle, a scar from a skiing accident when she was 15. She'd caught an edge on an icy slope, twisted wrong, torn ligaments badly enough to require surgery and 6 months of physical therapy. Every morning before the cult, Sarah woke at 7, made coffee in her dorm room using an electric kettle that was technically against housing rules, but that every student had anyway. Studied for an hour before her first class, usually child development or educational psychology. She was a good student, 3.5 grade point average, planning to teach elementary school after graduation, maybe get her master's degree eventually. Sarah's family was solidly middle class. Her mother Dorothy was a nurse at Denver General Hospital, 50 years old, divorced from Sarah's father when Sarah was 12. Her older brother Michael was 23, working construction in Denver, engaged to his high school girlfriend. They'd grown up in a comfortable suburb south of Denver, attended a moderate Presbyterian church, had the kind of stable, unremarkable childhood that created well-adjusted adults. What Sarah valued most wasn't academic achievement or career success, though those mattered. What she valued was purpose, the feeling that her life meant something beyond just existing. She'd grown up in a Christian household where faith was genuine but moderate, and she'd always felt like something was missing, like there should be more intensity, more certainty, more direct experience of God, than the polite Sunday services she'd grown up with. In January 1983, Sarah joined a campus Bible study organized by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, a mainstream evangelical campus ministry. The group met Tuesday nights in a common room at her dorm. 15 students, mix of freshmen and sophomores, discussing scripture and praying together, and building the kind of Christian community that felt meaningful without being overwhelming. After the third meeting, another student named Rebecca invited Sarah to a different Bible study. A smaller group that met off campus, more focused on spiritual growth and authentic Christianity. Sarah said yes. She had no idea that Rebecca was a Shepherd's Assembly recruiter whose job was identifying vulnerable students and drawing them deeper into the cult's orbit. The off-campus Bible study met in an apartment near the university. 8 students, all enthusiastic, all speaking with intensity about spiritual warfare and the end times, and taking faith seriously in ways that mainstream churches didn't. Sarah was impressed. These people weren't playing at Christianity. They were living it with a conviction she'd been searching for. After 3 weeks of off-campus Bible studies, Rebecca invited Sarah to a weekend retreat at the Shepherd's Assembly compound in Wyoming. It would be amazing, Rebecca promised. Deep teaching. Powerful worship. A chance to experience authentic Christian community. Sarah hesitated only briefly before saying yes. The weekend retreat in February 1983 was the moment Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell's life changed trajectory in ways she wouldn't understand until much later. The compound was isolated, 40 miles from Laramie on land that stretched for acres with no neighbors in sight. The main building was a converted barn that served as chapel, dining hall, and meeting space. Dormitories were separate buildings, men on one side of the compound, women on the other. Sarah arrived Friday evening with Rebecca and 3 other students from the university, was greeted with overwhelming warmth, hugs, smiles, people who remembered her name from one introduction and asked genuine questions about her life. The love bombing was subtle enough that Sarah didn't recognize it as manipulation. It just felt like the most welcoming Christian community she'd ever experienced. The weekend schedule was intense. Wake at 6 for morning prayer, breakfast at 7, teaching sessions from 9 to noon, lunch, more teaching from 2 to 5, dinner, evening worship from 7 to 10, then small group discussions that lasted until midnight. Total sleep maybe 5 hours before the cycle started again. The teaching was a mix of legitimate biblical content and cult doctrine, presented so smoothly that Sarah couldn't identify where one ended and the other began. James Whitfield preached about the corruption of mainstream Christianity, the need for true believers to separate from worldly compromise, the urgency of preparing for Christ's imminent return. He spoke with charisma and conviction, quoted scripture extensively, made it sound reasonable that authentic Christians should live in intentional community under strong spiritual authority. By Sunday evening, when it was time to return to campus, Sarah was hooked, not because she'd been overtly coerced, because she'd experienced something that felt more real, more intense, more meaningful than anything in her previous Christian experience. She'd found a community that seemed to take faith as seriously as she wanted to take it. Over the following weeks, Sarah attended more off-campus Bible studies, made more trips to the Wyoming compound, gradually spent less time with her university friends and more time with Shepherd's Assembly members. Her grades started slipping. She stopped calling her mother as frequently, started talking about spiritual warfare and demonic deception, and the corruption of worldly education. By April 1983, 3 months after her first contact with the group, Sarah had made a decision her mother would discover with absolute horror. She was withdrawing from the University of Northern Colorado, moving to the Shepherd's Assembly compound full-time, dedicating her life to preparing for the end times under the spiritual covering of James Whitfield and the community of true believers. She called her mother to explain. Dorothy Mitchell answered the phone expecting a normal conversation about classes and weekend plans. Instead, heard her daughter speak in language that sounded scripted about surrendering to God's will and the urgency of the end times and how the university had become a tool of Satan to distract her from her true calling. Dorothy drove to Greeley immediately, found Sarah packing her dorm room, tried to reason with her, tried to remind her of her plans to become a teacher, her academic achievements, the life she was throwing away. Sarah responded with calm certainty. God had called her to a higher purpose. Education was worldly distraction. The shepherd's assembly was where she belonged. "What about your family?" Dorothy asked. "Your brother?" "Me?" "Family relationships are temporary," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "My eternal family is the community of believers. You're welcome to join us. But if you reject God's calling, I can't let your spiritual darkness interfere with my walk." Dorothy Mitchell left her daughter's dorm room, understanding she'd lost Sarah to something she didn't fully understand. Drove home to Denver crying so hard she had to pull over twice because she couldn't see the road, and started making phone calls to anyone who might help her get her daughter back. For 14 months, Dorothy tried everything conventional. She drove to the Wyoming compound 6 times, was turned away each time by members who explained politely but firmly that Sarah was exactly where she wanted to be and that Dorothy needed to respect her daughter's religious choices. She hired a lawyer who confirmed there was nothing legal to be done. Sarah was 19, legally an adult, had joined voluntarily. She contacted the FBI. They investigated the Shepherd's Assembly but found no evidence of criminal activity. Authoritarian religious control wasn't illegal as long as members were adults who joined voluntarily. She contacted cult awareness organizations who sympathized but explained that without Sarah wanting to leave, intervention was nearly impossible. Dorothy watched her daughter disappear. In June 1983, Sarah called home to announce she'd been given a new name, Sister Deborah. Her birth name represented her old worldly identity that had died when she surrendered to God. She wouldn't respond to Sarah anymore. Dorothy should address her as Sister Deborah if they communicated. The calls became less frequent. By August, Sarah called maybe once a month. By November, once every 2 months. Each call lasted 5 minutes maximum, Sarah speaking in monotone about the blessings of community and Dorothy's need to repent and accept God's truth. Dorothy would hang up and cry for hours. In February 1984, 14 months after Sarah had joined the cult, Dorothy received an unexpected call. Sarah wanted to visit, just for a weekend. The leadership had given permission. She wanted to see her family, share what God was doing in her life, maybe help them understand the truth. Dorothy knew immediately what was happening. Sarah hadn't left the cult. She'd been sent home to recruit. It was a standard cult tactic. Send members back to their families after enough time that the family is desperate for contact. Let the member present themselves as happy and fulfilled. Use that as leverage to recruit family members or at minimum extract money. Dorothy could have refused, could have told Sarah not to come if she was just going to proselytize, but Dorothy had been waiting 14 months for any opportunity to reach her daughter. And she'd spent those 14 months researching cults, reading about deprogramming, making contacts with people who'd escaped similar groups. She'd found Priscilla Coates, a woman who'd lost her own son to the Moonies, who'd hired Ted Patrick to deprogram him successfully, who'd been so affected by the experience that she'd learned deprogramming techniques herself and started helping other parents, who'd developed methods specifically designed for the religious cults that manipulated young women with doctrines about submission, purity, and spiritual authority. Dorothy called Priscilla in February 1984, explained the situation with Sarah, asked if there was anything that could be done. Priscilla listened carefully, asked detailed questions about Sarah's involvement, her psychological state, her family relationships before recruitment. Then Priscilla asked the question that would define everything that followed. If Sarah comes home for a visit, are you willing to keep her there against her will and let me deprogram her? Dorothy hesitated only a moment. Yes, whatever it takes. Priscilla Coates was 52 years old in March 1984. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, 140 pounds. With short grey hair, she kept practical and no nonsense. She had a scar on her right hand from a cooking accident years ago, 3 fingers that had been badly burned, when she grabbed a pot handle that was hotter than she'd realized. The scar tissue was shiny, tight, a permanent reminder that sometimes trying to help can hurt you, Every morning, Priscilla woke at 5:30, made tea, Earl Grey with milk, spent 30 minutes reading news and cult awareness literature to stay current on recruitment tactics, then prepared for whatever deprogramming case she was currently working. She'd deprogrammed 27 people since 1979 when she'd started this work. Success rate approximately 70%, slightly lower than the male deprogrammers, but Priscilla attributed that to taking harder cases, working with young women who'd been in authoritarian religious groups where the psychological manipulation was especially sophisticated. What Priscilla valued most wasn't success rate or reputation. What she valued was giving parents hope when every other option had failed. She'd been that parent, had watched her son disappear into the Moonies, had felt the helplessness, the rage, the grief, had hired Ted Patrick out of desperation, had gotten her son back but also seen how violent and traumatic the process could be. She'd decided to learn deprogramming herself specifically, to develop methods that were less violent, more psychologically sophisticated, more effective for the specific ways religious cults manipulated women. Because Priscilla had noticed something the male deprogrammers often missed. Young women in religious cults experienced manipulation that was gendered, focused on submission to male authority, purity culture, spiritual covering, doctrines that made questioning male leadership equivalent to rebelling against God. Male deprogrammers could break down the theological arguments, but they struggled with the psychological layers that made young women believe that asserting their own judgment was spiritual rebellion. Priscilla, as a woman who'd grown up in conservative Christianity herself, understood those dynamics intimately, could identify them, name them, dismantle them in ways that felt less like attack and more like liberation. The plan Priscilla designed for Sarah Mitchell's deprogramming was straightforward. Sarah would arrive home for her weekend visit. Dorothy would act normally, not raising suspicion. On the first evening, Dorothy's brother Tom, who lived in the mountains outside Denver, would show up unexpectedly and invite them to his cabin for a family dinner. Sarah would go willingly because the cult taught maintaining some family contact for recruiting purposes. Once at the cabin, Dorothy and Tom would explain that Sarah wasn't leaving for a few days, that Priscilla Coates would be arriving to help Sarah process her experiences with the Shepherd's Assembly, that they loved her and were doing this because they couldn't watch her waste her life in a cult. The risks were significant. Kidnapping charges if Sarah decided to prosecute after the deprogramming, permanent destruction of the mother-daughter relationship if the deprogramming failed or traumatized Sarah beyond recovery, physical danger if Sarah fought hard enough to hurt herself or others, and the possibility that even if the deprogramming worked, Sarah would carry trauma from being held against her will by her own mother. But Dorothy Mitchell had reached the point where any action felt better than watching her daughter disappear into an authoritarian cult that controlled every aspect of her life. She paid Priscilla $8,000, her savings, money she'd been setting aside for retirement. Priscilla took the money and promised nothing except that she'd do everything possible to help Sarah remember who she'd been before the Shepherd's Assembly convinced her she was someone else. On March 17, 1984, Sarah Mitchell arrived at her mother's house in Denver at 4 in the afternoon. She looked different, thinner. Her hair was long but unkempt. She wore a long denim skirt and a modest blouse that covered her completely. No makeup, no jewelry. The kind of plain presentation that certain religious groups demanded as evidence of spiritual purity. She hugged her mother stiffly, sat in the living room making awkward conversation, talking about the blessings of community life and how fulfilled she felt, and would Dorothy like to visit the compound and see what God was doing there? Dorothy played along, said maybe she would visit, asked questions that sounded interested but not challenging. At 6, Dorothy's brother Tom arrived as planned. Said he was making dinner at his cabin, would love for Dorothy and Sarah to join him. Sarah hesitated. She'd been instructed to maintain some family contact, but not to go anywhere isolated where they might try to talk her out of her commitment. But Tom was persuasive. Just dinner. Just family. An hour or two maximum. Sarah agreed. Tom's cabin was 40 miles west of Denver on a dirt road that wound through pine forests. The cabin was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a main room with a fireplace. Isolated enough that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Sarah noticed the isolation as they drove, started to feel uneasy. When they arrived, Tom parked close to the cabin, walked Sarah and Dorothy inside, locked the door behind them. Sarah noticed, turned to leave, found the door locked from the inside with a deadbolt that required a key she didn't have. "What is this?" Sarah's voice was rising toward panic. "Mum, what's going on? We need to talk," Dorothy said. Her voice was shaking. "We need to really talk, Sarah, not you preaching at me, not you repeating cult scripts. We need you to think about what's happened to you in the last 14 months. "I'm leaving," Sarah said. She tried the door, pulled on it, started pounding. "Let me out. This is kidnapping. You can't do this." A car pulled up outside. Priscilla Coates got out, walked to the cabin, let herself in with a key Tom had given her. Sarah saw her and immediately understood what was happening. "No," Sarah said. Her voice was cold. "You hired a deprogrammer. You're going to try to destroy my faith. You're doing Satan's work." "I'm trying to give you your life back," Dorothy said. She was crying now. "I'm trying to save you from a cult that's stolen 14 months from you and will steal the rest of your life if I don't stop it." The deprogramming of Sarah Mitchell began with a simple question from Priscilla Coates. "Sarah, can you tell me what you believed about God before you joined the Shepherd's Assembly?" Sarah looked at Priscilla with pure contempt. "I don't have to tell you anything. You're a tool of Satan. This is spiritual warfare." "Maybe," Priscilla said calmly, "but I'm asking anyway. Before James Whitfield, before the compound, what did you believe about God?" Sarah was silent for a long time. Then, reluctantly, "I believed God loved everyone, that Jesus died for everyone's sins. That salvation was through faith. And now I know that most of Christianity is compromised, that true believers have to separate from the world, that James Whitfield is God's chosen prophet for the end times." Priscilla nodded. "Okay. So in 14 months your entire theology changed. Can you explain how that happened? What specific evidence convinced you that everything you believed for 19 years was wrong?" Sarah's face did something complicated. A flicker of uncertainty quickly suppressed. "I learned the truth, the Word of God properly interpreted by James Whitfield," Priscilla clarified. "You learned James Whitfield's interpretation, not God's truth directly, James Whitfield's version of it. He's God's prophet, how do you know?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, closed it. The programming provided responses, but Priscilla's question bypassed them. How did she know James Whitfield was God's prophet? Because he said so. Because the community believed it. Because questioning him was presented as spiritual rebellion. "He speaks with authority," Sarah finally said. "God's anointing is on him." "That's not evidence," Priscilla said gently. "That's circular reasoning. He's God's prophet because he has authority. He has authority because he's God's prophet. But what actual evidence do you have that his authority comes from God rather than from psychological manipulation?" "You're trying to confuse me," Sarah said. "This is what Satan does, uses logic and doubt to undermine faith. Or maybe I'm asking you to think critically about something you've been trained not to question," Priscilla suggested. The first night was brutal. Sarah refused to engage beyond repeating Shepherd's Assembly doctrine, refused to eat the food Dorothy prepared because it hadn't been prayed over by leadership and was therefore spiritually unclean, refused to sleep because she needed to pray for deliverance from this satanic attack. Dorothy sat with her daughter through the night, didn't try to force conversation, just maintained presence. By dawn, Sarah was exhausted. Priscilla returned at 6 in the morning, fresh from sleeping at a motel nearby, ready to continue. By the second day, Sarah's resistance was starting to crack, not because Priscilla was arguing against her faith, because Priscilla was asking questions Sarah had been trained never to ask. Questions about evidence, about authority, about the specific mechanisms the Shepherd's Assembly used to control members. Priscilla showed Sarah a timeline, asked her to map out how her beliefs had changed month by month after joining. Sarah did it reluctantly, then looked at the timeline with growing unease. In January, she'd believed mainstream Christianity was valid. By February, she believed it was compromised. By March, she believed it was satanic. By April, she'd surrendered all her possessions and moved to the compound. "That's a lot of theological change in very little time," Priscilla observed. "Can you identify what specific evidence caused each shift? Or did the shifts happen because you were being love-bombed, sleep-deprived, and surrounded by people who all reinforced the same message?" Sarah's face crumpled. "I don't know," she whispered. "I thought I was learning truth. But when you map it out like this, it looks like manipulation." The breakthrough came on day 3. Dorothy showed Sarah photographs from before the cult. Sarah at her high school graduation. Sarah with friends. Sarah laughing, looking alive and present. And then photographs from Sarah's visits home after joining. The difference was stark. The light had gone out of her eyes. She looked thinner, hollow, like a shell of herself. "Who is that person?" Dorothy asked, pointing to the high school graduation photo. "That's me," Sarah said. "Before." "Before what?" "Before I found truth. Or before you lost yourself," Dorothy suggested. Sarah stared at the photographs, started crying. Real crying. Not the programmed tears of someone whose faith is being tested. Deep, grieving tears of someone beginning to realize what had been taken from her. Over the next 3 days, days 4 through 6, Priscilla guided Sarah through examining her recruitment, the love bombing, the sleep deprivation, the isolation from outside perspectives, the thought-stopping techniques that labeled doubt as satanic, the authority structure that made questioning leadership equivalent to rebelling against God. Sarah's anger shifted, from directed at her mother for kidnapping her to directed at the Shepherd's Assembly for manipulating her. At James Whitfield for claiming divine authority he didn't have. At herself for falling for it. But the anger was healthy. It meant Sarah was thinking critically again, was recognizing manipulation, was reclaiming her ability to judge for herself instead of surrendering judgment to authority. On day 6, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell made a decision. "I'm not going back," she told her mother, "to the compound, to James Whitfield, to any of it. I'm done." "Are you sure?" Priscilla asked. "Because the cult will try to contact you. They'll send members to convince you that you've been deceived by Satan. You need to be absolutely certain before we let you leave this cabin." "I'm sure," Sarah said. She sounded exhausted but clear. "I see it now. What they did to me. How they used my faith against me. And I can't go back to that." The legal consequences of Dorothy Mitchell's decision to have her daughter deprogrammed were minimal. The Shepherd's Assembly filed police reports claiming kidnapping, but Sarah refused to cooperate with any investigation, told police she'd gone willingly with her mother, that she'd been brainwashed by a cult and was grateful for the intervention. Without a cooperative victim, and with Sarah publicly stating she'd been rescued rather than kidnapped, prosecutors declined to file charges. The civil suit the Shepherd's Assembly filed was dismissed when Sarah testified that she'd been psychologically coerced by the cult and that her mother had acted appropriately. Sarah spent the next year in intensive therapy, worked with a psychologist who specialized in religious trauma, processed both her time in the Shepherd's Assembly and the deprogramming itself, because even though Sarah was grateful to be out, being held against her will by her own mother had created complicated feelings that took years to untangle. She returned to the University of Northern Colorado in fall 1985, changed her major from elementary education to psychology with a focus on religious manipulation, graduated in 1987, went to graduate school, became a therapist specializing in helping people exit high-control religious groups. 10 years after the deprogramming, Sarah married a man named Thomas Chen, a software engineer she'd met through mutual friends. Thomas knew about her cult past. She told him on their 4th date because hiding trauma doesn't make it go away. Thomas listened without judgment, told her that who she'd been at 19 didn't define who she was at 29. 15 years after the deprogramming, Sarah and Thomas had twins, a boy and a girl. Sarah was intensely protective, but tried not to be controlling, taught her children critical thinking skills, helped them understand how to recognize manipulation, but also respected their autonomy in ways that showed she'd learned from her own experience. 20 years after the deprogramming, Sarah received news that James Whitfield had been arrested on fraud charges related to the Shepherd's Assembly's finances. The compound was shut down, members scattered. Some returned to their families, some joined other groups, some never fully recovered. Sarah felt nothing. Not vindication, not satisfaction, just emptiness where complicated feelings about Whitfield had lived for 2 decades. She'd moved past him. Built a life defined by her choices, not his manipulation. 30 years after the deprogramming, Sarah spoke at a conference about religious trauma and recovery. Told her story to an audience of therapists and former cult members. Talked about being kidnapped by her mother, about hating Dorothy for violating her autonomy, about the slow process of understanding that both things could be true, that her mother had saved her and traumatized her in the same action. At the end of her talk, someone asked the question Sarah had been asked hundreds of times: was your mother right to have you deprogrammed against your will? Sarah's answer was nuanced. She was right that I needed help. Right that the Shepherd's Assembly was destroying my life. Right that I couldn't see the manipulation from inside it. But was she right to kidnap me? I honestly don't know. It worked. I'm grateful I got out. But the method was violent. Violated my autonomy even though my autonomy had been compromised. 30 years later, I still carry both gratitude and trauma. Both things are true. 40 years after the deprogramming, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell Chen was 59 years old, still working as a therapist, still helping people navigate the aftermath of religious manipulation. Her mother Dorothy had passed away in 2019 at 86, having lived long enough to see her daughter build a meaningful life and to meet her grandchildren. Before Dorothy died, Sarah had told her mother something she'd been working toward in therapy for decades. I understand why you did it. I'm grateful you loved me enough to fight for me. And I forgive you for the ways it hurt me. Both things can be true. The question that defined Sarah's adult life wasn't whether Priscilla Coates was right to deprogram her or whether her mother was right to hire Priscilla. It was a deeper question about autonomy, manipulation, faith, and the point where religious conviction becomes religious coercion. Sarah had spent 40 years thinking about that question, and she'd concluded that maybe the answer was less important than the process of asking it. That living with complexity was better than forcing simple answers onto complicated situations. If this story made you think about faith, family, and the price mothers pay when they fight to save their daughters from religious manipulation, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to Cult Exit for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about cults, deprogramming, and the thin line between religious freedom and psychological control. Comment below: was Dorothy right to have her daughter deprogrammed? Where do you draw the line between saving someone and violating their rights? Can you fight religious manipulation with more psychological pressure? Because these stories aren't just history. Right now somewhere, another young woman is being recruited by an authoritarian religious group that will use her faith against her. Another mother is watching helplessly as her daughter disappears into doctrines about submission and spiritual authority. Another family is facing the same impossible choice Dorothy Mitchell faced in 1984. Until next time, remember, sometimes the people who save you are the people who hurt you. Sometimes a mother's love looks like violence. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing terrible things. And sometimes 40 years later, you're still trying to figure out if it was worth it.